We're looking at a sugya in Masechet Beitza on Daf Tes with regard to hafrashas chala on Yontif. And we know that the Torah permits ochel nefesh on Yontif, and if it's necessary to be mafresh chala, then we should be able to allow to be mafresh chala on Yontif. However, the issue is because the Rabbanan prohibited hafrashas truma umaiser on Yontif. The reason why the Rabbanan did so is not 100% clear. There may be a machlokas about this that we'll see, but at least according to Rashi's Shita, this is based on the concept of nire kemesakin mona. Now, tikkun mona is a told of meleches bona, or possibly a meleches makabepatish. And presumably those malachos were not allowed, were not permitted on Yontif. Therefore, the Rabbanan prohibited being mafresh truma or maser on Yontif. So again, even though on a doraisa level it should be mutter, because it really isn't actually tikkun mana, but it's like tikkun mana. And the Chachamim said that you should not be mafresh, truma, and maser on Yontif. However, in the case of chala, it's a little bit different. And here, we're going to see the sheet of Rabbah that it is permitted to be mafresh chala on Yontif. But there's another element that comes into the equation, and that is, why was he mafresh chala on Yontif? Why couldn't he be mafresh on Erev Yontif? And then avoid the whole issue of hafroshas chala. Meaning, since we have an iser of hafroshas trumo maser, then hafroshas chala likewise should be prohibited. And if there's some reason why we want to allow hafroshas chala on Yontif, well, what happens in a case where everything was prepared on Erev Yontif, and we could say to him, well, why didn't you be mafresh, why aren't you mafresh chala on Erev Yontif and avoid the whole issue? And Rabbah says here, Gilgel Isa me Erev Yontif, mafresh mimenu chalasa b'Yontif. So let's talk about 2 points that Rabbah is making. Point number one is called Gilgul Isa, otherwise known as Lisha. Again, there are many different stages in Lisha that follows beyond Nesinas Hamayim. So we're not sure exactly what stage we're talking about in Metzius, but we know Al Pi Din, Gilgul Isa generates a chiyuv hafroshas chala and a shem tevel. Now, let's talk about a different case, not the case of Rabbah where he could have been mafresh chala on Erev Yontif, but let's talk about a case where he makes his Isa on Yontif. And the reason he made his Isa on Yontif, and he went through the entire process of Lisha, is because he wants to get fresh bread straight out of the oven, and that enhances his Simchas Yontif. So in that case, it's mutter. In other words, there never was a Gzeira Chachamim to prohibit hafrashas chala on Yontif in the same way that they were gozer not to be mafresh truma maser. And that means that there's no reason why he couldn't have been mafresh his truma maser on Erev Yontif. But in the case of chala, the reason why he wasn't mafresh his chala on Erev Yontif is because he wanted to get a fresh baked bread on Yontif, and therefore he needs his dough on Yontif, which is called Gilgel Isa. So the Rabbanan never made a gzeira to prohibit hafrashas chala on Yontif because they wanted him to feel absolutely free of any shackles, of any inhibitions that would prevent him from kneading his dough on Yontif. And therefore, once you knead the dough, you put it right in the oven and you end up with a fresh baked bread. But Rabbah is going a step further. Rabbah is saying that not only, and now this is a double negative, not only did they not create a gzera to prohibit hafrashas challah on Yontif, but even in a case where he could have easily have done hafrashas challah on Erev Yontif because he was Gilgel Isa Me'erev Yontif, nevertheless, despite that, we're not going to say to him, buddy, we're penalizing you. Why didn't you do the hafrasha of challah on Erev Yontif? Why did you leave it till Yontif? And we're going to allow him to be mafresh challah on Yontif. There was no gzera at all prohibiting hafrashas challah on Yontif because since, again, let's go through the logic again, since there was a vested interest for the Chazal to make a person feel uninhibited, unfettered, to be Magalgel Isa and put the Isa into the oven on Yontif, they did not prohibit hafrashas challah. And Rabbah says they didn't even prohibit hafrashas challah in a scenario in which he created his Gilgul Isa on Erev Yontif. And that means that, according to Rabbah, there's an absolute rule that the Rabbanan never prohibited hafrashas challah on Yontif. In the pages that I sent you, I'm going to just read the Masifta as he interprets Rabbah. He says, "V'afshe shanidu b'mishnah." There's a Mishnah at the end of Beitza Lamed Vav Beisha Gozu Chacham Shein Lafresh Shumas Maisus B'Yontif. So you might assume that the case of hafrashas challah should be subsumed and included under the Isur Gzeres Chacham of hafrashas Truma Maser. And the reason why the Chachamim did so in the case of Truma Maser should apply equally well to hafrashas challah, and that is Mishum Shenira Kimisakin Esaperos, and Tikkun Mana is, shall we say, a told of either Makabeh Patish or perhaps a Meleches Boneh. And not only that, in the case of Truma Maser, you know what? He could have been mafresh Truma Maser on Erev Yontif. There's no, shall we say, justification for him to delay his hafrashas Truma Maser to Yontif. And therefore there was a gzera. Now here we could ask a question. Would this gzera apply in a case where he had no possibility of being mafresh Truma Maser on Erev Yontif? For example, let's say somebody on Yontif brings him an entire basket of peiros at a tevel, and he can't eat it on Yontif because he needs hafrasha. Would he be allowed to do the hafrasha? I'm not sure about that. I just simply don't know. But as a general rule, in 99 out of 100 cases, he could have been mafresh equally well on Erev Yontif. There was no reason to postpone his hafrasha to Yontif. And therefore, the Rabbanan instituted a gzera prohibiting hafrashas trumas and maisros on Yontif because it's nira k'mesakin es haperos. And it would seem that if we only had the problem of nira k'mesakin es haperos, if we wouldn't be able to point our finger at him and say to him, hey, why weren't you mafresh yesterday on Erev Yontif? If that was an impossibility, then we would overlook the nira k'mesakin mana for the sake of his enjoyment of Yontif. So in effect, we really have here sort of like an overlap, one layer on top of the other of two different factors that are playing in the case of Trumas and Masros. Number one, that it's nira k'mesakin, and number two, we have a right to say to him, why weren't you mafresh on Erev Yontif? So that's the gzera of hafrashas Trumas and Masros on Yontif. Oh, comes along Rabbah, and he says that if he did the Gilgul Isa on Erev Yontif, we should be able to say to him both those arguments. Number one, if he's going to be mafresh Trumas and Maasros on Yontiv, it looks like Misakin Peros, just like in the case of Trumas and Maasros. And furthermore, why weren't you mafresh your challah on Erev Yontiv? You were Megalgal Le'is on Erev Yontiv. That generates the Chiyuv Hafroshas Challah. And why didn't you do it on Erev Yontiv? The answer is, says Rabbah, they never made a gzera on Hafroshas Challah on Yontiv. In the case of Trumas and Masra, since normally you would be mafresh Trumas and Maasros before Yontiv at no loss, they made a gzera of tikkun of nira kimitakin mona. In the case of challah, on the other hand, since normally you would be mafresh your challah on Yontiv because you want to knead your dough on Yontif and get a fresh baked piece of bread. Therefore, they never instituted the Isra Afrosha. In other words, you basically have one element of the equation, namely it's Nira Kimisakin Mana, but you don't have the other element of the equation, namely why weren't you mafresh yesterday? Because in most cases, the Afrosha would take place on Yontif as opposed in contrast to Trumas and Maasros. So they never made a Gzera, according to Rabbah at least, to prohibit Afrosha's Chal on Yontif. So that even though, you know what, you could have done it on Erev Yontif after the Gilgal Isa on Erev Yontif, but nevertheless, we don't have an Isa Gzera of Afrosha's Chal. It never was instituted. And therefore, you're allowed to be mafresh, your Truma, your Chala on Yontif. So that is the Shita of Rabbah. Now the Gemara says, but there's another Shita, a dissenting view of Avur de Shmuel. Now, a lot of what's in the background to this sugya is an earlier sugya on Daf Zayin in Beitza, but I'm just going to mention it in passing. I don't know if we're going to get into that sugya today, and that is the sugya of Shchitas, it's Ophos or Chayos on Erev Yontif. Why? Because in the case of Ophos and Chayos, there's a requirement of Kisi Adam. And to be Mekayim Kisi Adam, you'd have to dig into the ground, and that would be a problem of Aleches Charisha, which was never permitted on Yontif. And therefore, if you shechted, let's say, a bird on Erev Yontif, and now you want to do the Kisi Adam, but it's already Yontif, so that we're not allowed to do. Again, if he shechted the tzipor on Yontif, that's a whole different story. And then it depends upon whether he prepared the ground, meaning he has to do what's called noatz dakar, deker. But leave that out because that's already the sugis at the beginning of Masechet Beitza. However, let's say a person has what we call ofar muchan, right? He has a dekel nodes, and that he prepared on Erev Yontif, and now he shechts the bird on Yontif, we're going to allow him to do the Kisi Adam. So even though we're not always thrilled about Kisi Adam, because if we allow him to do it when he dug in the shovel into the ground on Erev Yontif, he might come to dig in the shovel on Yontif, but nevertheless, we're going to allow it, but there's another factor here, and that is, could he have done it on Erev Yontif? So if he shechted the oaf on Erev Yontif, we're not going to allow him to do the Kisi Adam on Yontif, because we're going to say to him, why didn't you do the Kisi Adam on Erev Yontif after the Shechita? And now Shmuel is going to take, Avud de Shmuel is going to take the exact logic and apply it here to the case of Hafroshas Chal. Afilu Gilgal Isa me Erev Yontif, ein mafresh mimenu chalosa b'yontif. Comes along Shmuel, Avud de Shmuel. I have to say Avud de Shmuel because Shmuel is going to disagree. Avud de Shmuel is of the opinion that although if he did the Gilgal Isa on Yontif, in order to get a fresh baked bread, we're going to allow him to be mafresh the challah on Yontif. But if he did the Gilgal Isa on Erev Yontif, then we have another argument against him, and that is, why didn't you do the hafrashas challah on Erev Yontif? And as a result, we're not going to allow him to do the hafrashas challah on Yontif. So he says here, I'm just again reading the translation, the commentary. He says, "Lo itiru lahafresh challah b'yontiv ela be'isa me'isa shenisgalgala b'yontiv," because then there was no possibility of hafrashas challah on erev yontiv. Avol me'isa shenisgalgala b'erev yontiv, and we could say to him, "Why weren't you be mafresh on erev yontiv?" Shoyet tzorich lahafresh mimenu challah b'erev yontiv, asru lahafresh challah b'yontiv. And now, what Avud Shmuel is doing is he's taking the case of Hafrashas Challah and subsuming it under the Gzeira of Hafrashas Trumas and Maasros. And basically now the situation of Hafrashas Challah, according to Avud Shmuel, is exactly parallel to the situation of shechting a tzipor, meaning, if he shechted the tzipor on Yontif and he has a dekel notes, etc., then we're going to allow him to do the Kisei Adam. But if he did the shechit on Erev Yontif, we're going to say to him, why didn't you do the Kisei Adam on Erev Yontif? And the same thing applies to Hafrashas Challah. If he was Megalgal the Isa on Yontif, we'll allow him to be Mafresh Challah. If on the other hand he was Megalgal the Isa on Erev Yontif, then we're not going to allow. Because we're going to basically say to him, why weren't you mafresh challah on Erev Yontif? And again, we have that other element, namely of Nirikim Esakin Mona. So let's take a moment, if we can, to try to figure out the machlokas here between Rabba and Avud Shmuel. I think that the machlokas lies in the area of balancing two factors that pull in different directions. On the one hand, we have vested interest to allow him to be mafresh challah on Yontif because we want him to be able to eat this challah and enjoy the Yontif. But on the other hand, we have reason to say, look, this is nira k'mesakim mon, it's like Trumas and Maasros. Why weren't you mafresh on Erev Yontif? So Rab's approach was, well, just like we allowed hafrashas Trumas and Maasros on Yontif itself, in a case where the Gilgal was on Yontif, then we're never going to prohibit hafrashas chal. I never say chal if I said so, right? Just like we're allowing you to be mafresh chal on Yontif, then that's it. There was never a gzera established by the Chachamim on hafrashas chal. Whereas Avud Shmuel holds that potentially there's a gzera of hafrashas challah on Yontif. And the reason for that is because it has the same characteristics of hafrashas Trumas and Maasros, that it's nira k'mesakin mon. But in the case of challah, there was a push, what I call a dechia, to override that Isra hafrasha for the sake of having a fresh piece of bread. But if he started the process already yesterday, he can't hide himself behind the excuse, well, I wanted a fresh piece of bread. He should have been mafresh challah on Erev Yontif. That's the shita of Abba Shmuel, of Avud Shmuel. So both Abba Shmuel, Avud Shmuel, and Rabbah are working with the assumption that we want to find a heter for Hafrashas Challah to allow him to enjoy the benefit of Yontif by eating this challah. But the machlokas is because there's a possibility that he'll do the Gilgal on Erev Yontif, should the Rabbanan make a Gzeira and subsume Hafrashas Challah under the generic Gzeira of Hafrashas Trumas and Maasros? And Rabbi's answer is no. Rabbi's answer is that since in most cases we're going to override any consideration about prohibiting with Gzeira Hafrashas Challah, and the reason for that is because in most cases he wants to have a Challah that's fresh. Therefore, they excluded Hafrashas Challah from the original Gzeira of Trumas and Maasros. Whereas Avud Shmuel said, no, Hafrashas Challah, like Trumas and Maasros, is identical. It was included in the Gzeira. It's Nira K'Misakin Mana. But in the case of Challah, there's a Koach HaDechiyah for the sake of getting him a Pas Chama. But in the case of Gilgal Isa B'Erev Yontif, we go back to square one, to the original Gzeira of Trumas and Maasros, which included also Hafrashas Challah. So now the Gemara asks, Lema de Pliga Shmuel, the Pliga de Shmuel Adavua. We're going to now quote a statement of Shmuel that seems to indicate that Shmuel rejects his father's position, which in and of itself is not such a catastrophe, but it should be avoided if possible, that Shmuel would have rejected his father. Now the Gemara is going to quote Shmuel to prove that according to Shmuel, you'd be allowed to be mafresh challah even with regard to an isa shenis galgala be'erev yontif. However, here we have to introduce a new concept, and that's called chalas chutz la'aretz. Until this point, we've been operating with dagon grains that grew in Eretz Yisrael, and the mitzvah tluis ba'aretz apply to grains that grew in Eretz Yisrael. What is the status of grains that grew in chutz la'aretz? You take these grains and you grind them and you make them into flour, and then you add the water and you bake a bread. Is there a mitzvah of hafrashas challah? It's not included in mitzvah tluis ba'aretz because mitzvah tluis ba'aretz is the chovas karka, and this grew not on the holy soil of Eretz Yisrael, but rather on the unholy soil of Boston or Silver Spring or Passaic or wherever. Okay, so now we have a Gzeira de Rabbanan. And the Rabbanan said, you know what? We're in Golus, and the generations are going to pass by. Who's going to remember the institution of Challah? So they instituted Hafrashas Challah in Chutz La'aretz. But now the question is, does Chalas Chutz La'aretz have the same status as Chalas Eretz Yisrael? Now, until this point, until we introduce the statement of Shmuel, which we're about to introduce, there was no differentiation made with regard to Yontif between Chalas Eretz Yisrael and Chalas Chutz La'aretz. All the principles that we were applying would be applicable in all cases of Challah, whether it's Chalas Eretz Yisrael or Chalas Chutz La'aretz. Meaning that according to Rabbah, since we want to remove any inhibitions about Hafrashas Challah in a case of Gilgal Isa on Yontif, therefore there was never a prohibition about Gzeira regarding Hafrashas Challah on Yontif. However, Avur the Shmuel is of the opinion that no, that Hafrashas Challah, like Trumas of Maasros, was included in the Gzeira. And apparently that would apply even to Chalas Chutz La'aretz, because Chalas Chutz La'aretz midrabanan requires hafrasha. And presumably, if you're not mafresh, then just like in Trumas of Maasros, if you're not mafresh, Truma Maisa, then you're in a state of tevel, and you get a chiv misa b'dei shamayim. So too in Chala. Okay, in Chalas Chutzotz, it's only the Rabbanon. But the Rabbanon is, we have a principle called Kol the Tikkun Rabbanon Kei Doraisa Tikkun. So we assume that the Gzero, or shall we say the Takana of Chalas Chutzotz should be mirror imaged after Chalas Eretz Yisrael, after Chala Doraisa. And the same dinim that apply to Chala Doraisa should apply to Chalas Chutzotz. And therefore, you're not allowed to eat from this dough until after your mafresh challah, and that applies in Chutz La'aretz just as it does apply to Eretz Yisrael, only that it's only the Rabbanon. And therefore, Avur de Shmuel is going to prohibit being mafresh chalas Chutz La'aretz on Yontif in a case where Nisgalgala Isa be'erevna. But now we get to Shmuel. The Omar Shmuel chalas Chutz La'aretz ochel v'holech v'achar kach mafresh. Wow, this is a whole new set of dinim that apply to chalas Chutz La'aretz that do not apply to chala doraisa in Eretz Yisrael. Chala doraisa, before you eat from the bread, you've got to be mafresh chala, otherwise you're eating tevel and yichai misa b'dei shamayim. So the Chiyuv Hafrasha is reflective of the Shem Tevel and the Isur Achila that has to be removed through Hafrasha. So the Hafrasha is a matir, removing the Isur Tevel. That's true for Trumas Amaisa, and certainly it's true for Chala Doraisa. Hence, we begin to understand what does it mean when we say Metakein Mana. Nirakim Esakin here is based on the fact that you can't eat this unless you're mafresh. So you made the ochel edible from a halachic perspective, legally. Now, and again, your Hafrasha didn't add any ingredients or cooking or baking, but on a legal level, you made it possible to permit and give license to the achila. That's a tikkun mana. But now we introduce Shmuel with regard to chalas Chutz La'aretz. And Shmuel says in chalas Chutz La'aretz, there's no isur tevel. And therefore, that Hafrasha is not a matir. And therefore, that Hafrasha is not similar to tikkun mana. How do we see that Shmuel holds that in chalas Chutz La'aretz there's no isur tevel? Well, he says it explicitly. Could you imagine in Chalas Eretz Yisrael if I told you, eat the bread, and then, when you get to the end of the bread, leave over a little shtickle for Trumas and Maisros, or for Challah? That would be a violation of an Isur Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim. You're eating Tevel. You need that Hafrasha, Trumas Maisus in that case, of Chala in that case, in order to be Mater Achila, remove the Isur Tevel. And l'chora, the same logic and the same mechanism should apply in the case of Chalas Chutz La'aretz, because called the Tikkun Rabbanan Kei Doraisa Tikkun. And there should be an Isur Achila, comes along Shmuel, and he says, no, eat the bread before you mafresh Chala. And that means that there was never a Shem Tevel that was instituted by the Rabbanon when they enacted the halacha and the chova of Hafrashas Chalas Chutz La'aretz. Honestly, I don't know what happened to call the Tikka Doraisa Kein D'Rabbanan Tik. Call Tikka D'Rabbanan Kein Doraisa. That I can't figure out. But the bottom line is that Shmuel says there's no Isur to eat the bread before the Hafrasha, which means that there's no Shem Tevel, and moreover, you're not going to classify and define the Hafrasha of Chala and Chutz La'aretz as a matir, because there was no Isur to begin with. And Memela, if there's no matir, then it's not tikkun mana. And if it's not tikkun mana, it's going to be mutter on Yontif. And that's against Avur de Shmuel. Because Avur de Shmuel goes on record as saying that Gilgal Isa me Erev Yontif, and it applies equally well to both Chalas Eretz Yisrael and Chalas Chutz La'aretz, ein mafresh mimenu chalasa b'yontif. You're not allowed to be mafresh chala because there's a shame tevel, and you're being matu disa tevel, and that's called tikkun mana. But in truth, in chalas chutzot, it's not called tikkun mana. It's not a matu. There is no shame tevel because Shmuel holds holech ochel v'holech ad v'achkach mafresh. So let's read the commentary here. He writes, "Kala shemafrishim min ha'isa b'chutz la'aretz, kevan shemir rabbanan hi v'yena min ha'torah." I mean, Torah, it's only Dagon that grew in Eretz Yisrael. Excuse me for just 1 minute. Yeah. He says, "Kalashim afrishim min ha'isa b'chutz la'aretz kevan shemin rabbanan hi v'yena min ha'torah lo neseres ha'isa b'achila hodem hafrashas achala." And he means that there's no shame tevel in chalas chutz la'aretz. So it's a very strange kind of halach. He has to be mafresh chala, but yet it's not asur, and the isa is not tevel. It's a brand new halach here of hafrashas chala without a shame tevel. I mean, we never heard of such a thing. The alkain, if there's no shame tevel that generates an isa achila, eino tzarich la'afresh miyad. There's no rush over here. When you get a chance, you'll be mafresh challah, but in the meantime, enjoy the bread. Okay, let's qualify that. It doesn't mean eskol pas. Meshayir v'sofa k'shir afrasha, whatever the shir afrasha is, he's got to leave over a shir afrasha, because even in chalas chutzar, I mean, that's the whole entity of chalas chutzar. So the Rabban established you need afrasha, but you just have to leave over a little at the end, and v'achkach mafresh, and then whatever you left over to the end, you'll designate it as chal. In Cain, lamadnu b'divrei Shmuel she'ein ha'isa b'chutzar asura konim afrasha. Okay, that we know. Before your mafresh, there's no isa achila, according to Shmuel. Mishum sheyachal lahafresh achar ha'achila. So I'm going to skip a few words here because I don't understand what he adds here. Anyway, im kein ha'mafresh chala b'yontif eino mesakin davar. We should not subsume hafrashas chalas chutzarts under the iser of trumas and maisers, because in case of trumas and maisers, we have a situation of misaken because it's also and he's being matir. So the matir is the tikkun, but that doesn't have any parallel in hafrashas chalas chutzarts. So therefore, mafresh chalas chutzlarts b'yontiv eino mesakin davar. He left out the words chutzlarts here. Eino mesakin davar eino also b'yontiv kishar trumas and maisus asuras mishum shenera kemesakin davar. But I skipped a few words here. I'm not sure exactly what he adds here. He writes memela im mafresh mina isa. Hafrasha shalol tzarchi ve'ena nechsheves hafrasha. Just give me a minute. I'm not sure what he adds over. I'm trying to figure out. Usually, he's quoting Rishonim, so there must. It sounds like he's saying the following, that even if you would argue that chalas chutzos requires hafrasha, and therefore it's similar to hafrasha's trumas of maisrus, and lends itself therefore to the gzera of mishum nirike misaken on yontif, but nevertheless, no. Let me say it the other way around. Sorry. Right. No. What I mean to say is that although it's not nirike misaken because you're not being matir the achila is mutter even without afrasha. But even if you would somehow argue that there is an element of tikkun mana, and therefore we should allow afrasha, which again, I'm not sure what that element is, but let's see if we can identify it. But nevertheless, you might argue that, against Shmuel, that we should be matir afrasha for the sake of Simchas Yontif. And that we're not going to do. Why? Because it's hafrasha shelo litzorach. There's no pressing need here that we discussed earlier to allow hafrasha for the sake of Simchas Yontif, because he can enjoy the bread even without hafrasha. It's like, this reminds me of the concept, bracha she'eina tzricha. He calls it hafrasha shelo litzorach. Litzorach might have been a pressing factor to allow hafrasha, but what's pressing him? Well, what does he have to gain over here by doing hafrasha? After all, he's allowed to eat it even without hafrasha. And I'm not happy with what I said, because Adarabah, the Gemara is trying to prove that according to Shmuel, you'd be permitted to be mafresh chal on yontif. So it can't be that what he says here, hafrasha shelo litzorech, means that there's no sibas hamatir, because we're trying to explain that there is a matir. So what does he mean again? Hafrasha shelo litzorech. So I'm not sure where he gets this terminology from. but I don't want to spend too much time on that, on Afrasha Shalol Tzara. But I think the punchline of what he's saying is that we could be matir Afrasha Shalol Tzara, meaning we could be matir Afrasha if the Afrasha doesn't accomplish what it always accomplishes, namely to be matir, and that would make it like a tikkun mana. But here it's not like a tikkun mana because the heter is there, it's built in. He doesn't need a heter. That's what shalol l'tzarech means. Shalol l'tzarech means he doesn't even need a heter. And therefore it's not considered afrasha in the sense of tikkun mana. Because afrasha / tikkun mana means a matir v'achila. That's what makes it into a tikkun mana, is that it's matir achila. But here, where you already have a heter achila, so your afrasha is not a afrasha nira kimisake, namely a afrasha of a matir, because you don't need this afrasha to be matir, because ochel v'holech v'achar kach maf. If I was the editor, I would have left out that whole sentence. I don't think it does more than just to confuse us. Okay, now we get to Rav. So let's just summarize. Until now, we have Rabbah, we have Avud Shmuel, and we have Shmuel. Roman numeral number 1, Roman numeral number 2, and Roman numeral number 3. And let's just summarize that before we get to Rava, which is the sort of Makkah Patish of the Sugya. Rabbah says that there was never a gzera prohibiting Afrashas Chala on Yontif, period. And we explained the reasoning for that is because Chachamim wanted to remove any impediments, any inhibitions from his being megalgel the Isa and baking it as a fresh bread on Yontif. So therefore, they allowed Hafrashas Chala, and they never included it in the Gzeir. Now we get to Roman numeral number 2, and that's Avua de Shmuel. Avua de Shmuel says that, you know what? Hafrashas Chala is similar to Hafrashas Trumas and Maisrus, and it should be included in the Isa. Now you're right. I agree with you that there's a pressing need to allow Hafrashas Trumas, Hafrashas Chala, but that's only because he was Megalgil the Isa on Yont. And therefore there was no possibility of his being Mafresh Chala on Erev Yont. But in a pure theoretical world, in a matter of principle, then Hafrashas Chala should come under the general rubric of Hafrashas Trumas and Maisrus, and it's Nerikim Esakin. And keep in mind that Avud Shmuel does not differentiate between Chalas Eretz Yisrael and Chalas Chutzlaretz. Presumably, he's saying that even Chalas Chutzlaretz is also lahafresh Chala beyond, because it's Nerikim Esakin Mon. And Avud Shmuel is creating a Kol de Tikkun Rabbanan Kedoraisa, a parallel between Hafrashas Chala in Chutzlaretz and Hafrashas Truma, Meiser, and Chala in Eretz Yisrael. The Rabbanan equated them. And the import of that is to say that when you're Mafresh Chala in Chutzlaretz, that Hafrasha is a matir to remove the Isur Teva. And you would not be allowed to eat from the Chala in Chutzlaretz until you are Mafresh Chala, from the Isa, I should say. The Nela, it's Nerikim Esakin, comes under the Gzeira of Trumas and Maisrus. We might allow it and look the other way on Yontif if he's Megalgal Isa on Yontif, but if he's Megalgal Isa on Erev Yontif, then Ein mafresh chala b'yontif. One second, I don't understand. What does he mean afilu? What's the afilu? I don't understand the word afilu. Anybody know the word afilu here? What he means? We'll leave that for now. Then we get to Shmuel. And Shmuel says, guess what? Dad, your premise is incorrect. You're assuming call the Tikkun Rabbanon, and in Chalas Chutzot Rabbanon generated a shame tevel with an Isra Achila and Hafrosha that's going to remove the shame tevel and be matir, and therefore it's included under the Gzeira of Trumas and Maisros. No. The Rabbanon never instituted Chala and Chutzot to prohibit with a shame tevel Achila. Go ahead and eat it. Sei gesund. And at the end, leave over a little bit for challah. That was chala's chutzlaritz. Then, according to Shmuel, it becomes quite clear that chala's chutzlaritz hafrosha is not a tikkun mana. It's not in any way similar to hafrosha as trumas and maisros. You're not being matir or anything. It was mutter even before the hafrosha, and it would not be included in the Isur of Yontiv, and that's against Avud Shmuel. Now we're up to Rav. Omar Rav lo. Rav says, no, Shmuel does not disagree with his father. And I think you could say it the other way as well. Avud Shmuel does not disagree with Shmuel. You're allowed to eat from this challah even before you are mafresh. Which would bring us to the question, why is it tikkun mana? So the answer is that even Shmuel is modesh in kara aleh Hashem shasura lizarim. So I think what's going on here is that there's tzvei dinim in hafrashas chala. There's one din of hafrashas chala normally, let's say chalas Eretz Yisrael, of removing the Isur Tevel and being mater achila. There's another aspect to hafrashas chala, and that is to create chala. To generate a challah shem challah, which means that a zara, non-kohen, is not allowed to eat the challah. And chalas chutzot is a very strange kind of entity. On the one hand, it's not defined as a matir. There's no shem tevel, and there's no isra achila, but on the other hand, there is a chiyuv hafrasha. And that chiyuv hafrasha will generate a shem challah. And when the Rabbanon prohibited hafrashas trumas of maisros on Yontif, they included challah even in chutzarts as well. And why? Because the hafrasha is meaningful, not as a matir, but as an oser. It generates an Isur Zorus, and it creates a Chalus Shem Chala. And that too is considered a tikkun. I have to understand why. But now it's very interesting. We've been operating with the premise that the reason why Afrashas Trumas and Maisus is prohibited on Yontiv is because of the Gzeira that it's Nira K'Mesakin. The Rambam has a whole different approach. The Rambam's approach is that it's Nira K'Hegvesh. It's like he's being Magdish something. We're not allowed to be Magdish on Yontiv because that comes under the Isur Kinyonin. We're not going to make effectuated Kinyon. So I'm just thinking out loud, according to the Rambam, maybe that's exactly Rava's point over here. That even Shmuel would agree that Hafrashas challah in chutzaretz is included in the gzeira of Trumas and Maaseh for another reason entirely. Not midin tikkun mana, but midin hegdesh. That's why he's emphasizing asur l'zara. Asur l'zara mean that maybe on a D'Rabbanan level, maybe even on a D'Oraisa level, I don't know, the challah itself is hegdish. Or maybe you could say it a little differently, you're being makna it to kahuna. Only Kohanim are allowed to partake of this challah. So what I'd like to do now, just to end up for today, and again, as I said before, we have to decide for our next year, which will be, I think, on Thursday officially. I think, Jeff, you said Thursday you are on board, if I remember correctly. Did I get that right? I should write these things down.
I haven't been. We haven't had a share on Thursday at 9:35.
Oh, right. Where am I on Thursday? Remind me. If it's Thursday, I'm in Paris. Where am I on Thursday?
I don't know. Daf Yomi.
Oh, Daf Yomi. And then, just 1 second, Daf Yomi ends close to 11. Yeah, then I learn Sanhedrin. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so I'm going to be away from today, tomorrow, until a week or so later, until the 8th.
So you'll write me a little WhatsApp?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Till the 8th of June.
Nachon, yeah.
Yeah, and I think also Steve, I forgot exactly what date he's coming back on, also in June. Okay, so what I want to do to finish up for today is in the pages that hopefully you got. Now, how do I actually wrote numbers on them for my own purpose, so this is number 6, but there's a page that the top line on the page, if this helps, would be Gilgal Isa Me'erev Yontif. But that's not the section I want to look at. I'm looking at a section that's like in the middle of the page. Bir din ochav holech yakach mafresh, excuse me. So I don't know if you're able to find that page. It's if it helps anybody, it's, I think, 3 pages before the end of this whole section. Because all told, there are 8 pages. So in bold print, you'll see it says the Omer Shmuel, Talas, Chutz La'aretz, Ochel v'holech v'yachkach mafresh. Now, Kosvu Rishonim, in footnote number Yud, he says Tosfos, Rosh, Rashba, Ran, Meiri, like it's like all the Rishonim. She'af l'Shmuel tzorach she'yishayer b'sof achiloso ma'at yoser mishir chala. Okay, there are certain halachas here that are somewhat technical, called shiarim nikarim, but in any event, he's got to leave over a small amount that would be shiarim nikarim. Hiksha lefiza kilos Yaakov, that's Rav Yaakov Kamen. The Grach's father, Kanevsky, right? Rav Yaakov Kanevsky, the disciple. In Kain, ma maksha Gemara shebechalas chutz la'aretz ein mishum misaken, v'lo oso ma'at osur lechol lifnei afrosha. V'nimtza shafrosha matira oso ma'at, meaning bachiwa. So wait, so what's the oso ma'at? I think he says ma'at yosem mishir chal. So it means like that. The chal is divided now into three. There's the part that he eats. There's the part that's the shir chala, the minimum amount. Well, let's say it's a kazayas or whatever it is. And then he has to leave a little bit more, which he'd only be allowed to eat after that hafrosha. That middle section, which is a small amount, that makes it what's called shirayim nikarim. And that small amount needs a matir. And the only matir that you could have here is hafrosha. So you see that even according to Shmuel, say the Rishonim, hafrosha's chalas chutzlaretz is a matir. And therefore it should be tikkun mon. You'll see that he says hayamakom liyashev because eventually he's going to reject this based on the Mishkanas Yaakov. Shemi etzem mashem muter lechol v'akach lahafrish muchach she'ein chalas chutzotz toveles. Okay, that we said on our own. That chalas chutzotz is not called tevel. Both seres klaus isa b'achil k'mo chala min haTorah. So there's no chefza of chala. I'm sorry, there's no chefza of teva, and no isa b'achil. So we ask the question: so what's the point of the hafrosha over here? Hafrosha by definition means to remove the isa teva. No, he says eno el chiv ala gavra. Wow, this is a Stipler using brisket terminology here. It's a chiv ala gavra shechivu chachamim lahafrish hidei shelo tishtakach Torah's chala. So at this point, before Rava, the Gemara thinks that that hafrosha is unnecessary. It's just like a technical action. It's like go through the motions in order shelo tishtachach Torah's chala. V'al kain ein bekach mishum misaken klal. Sharei ein hafrosha matiras ha'isa Elohi mitzvah bi'alma. So I think he's saying now that even that little ma'at is only necessary in order to go through the motions and generate a ma'isa hafrosha. But that ma'at is mutar b'achila, like the rest of the lechem. The only thing that'll become also, as Rava points out, is that chala that you mafresh at the end. But that's what I think he's saying over there. Okay, there are both sides. This is where we're going to stop. And this was very interesting for me, like a little bit of an excursion into another area. And then we'll have to decide in terms of psachim. I'm going to look over the sugyas and see, maybe we can, I don't know. Okay, then. So everyone should be well and have a great day. Thank you so much.